Dale Nutt here with CFI Pro courses, and today we're going to wrap up the CFI regulations. We're still in the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations, Title 14, Chapter 1, Subchapter D, Part 61, and we're going to scroll all the way down to Subpart H is where we left off. And in that Subpart H, if you remember from last time, we left off right here on 61-189. So we're going to finish here on 61-191. And you can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more to go, and we'll be done. So let's start here with 61-191. We'll get our screen looking correctly. And let's start learning about these regs. So 61-191 talks about additional flight instructor ratings. Well, we're really not at that yet because we're not really doing any additional flight instructor ratings. You haven't got your first rating yet. But if you have, you can go ahead and look at this reg and let's see what it says. A person who applies for an additional flight instructor rating on a flight instructor certificate must meet the eligibility requirements listed in 61-183. So you don't get any leeway past 183. That apply to the flight instructor rating that you're currently seeking. A person who applies for an additional rating on a flight instructor certificate is not required to pass the knowledge test on the areas listed in 61.185 of this part. What does that mean? Well, it means you don't have to take the FOI test ever again, just one time. Is there a time in which you would have to take the FOI test again? And the answer is yes. And the answer would be if you got into a lot of trouble with the FAA and the FAA revoked all of your certificates, you would have to take the FOI test again. And that means if they took your ground instructor, your flight instructor, you would have to go back and retake that test again. So there is a situation in which you would have to do it, but hopefully you would not be subject to that particular restriction. All right, let's look at 61.193, and that talks about flight instructor privileges. So you are a flight instructor now. What can you do? A person who holds a flight instructor certificate is authorized within the limitations on that person's flight instructor certificate and ratings to train and issue endorsements that are required for this. Issue endorsements for a student pilot certificate. You can do it for a pilot certificate, a flight instructor certificate, a ground instructor certificate, an aircraft rating, an instrument rating, a flight review, or an operating privilege, recency of experience requirements of this part, practical test, knowledge test, and a person who holds a flight instructor certificate is authorized in a form and manner acceptable to the administrator, and we'll talk about what that is in a minute, to accept an application for a student pilot certificate, or for an applicant who holds a pilot certificate other than a student pilot certificate issued under Part 61 of this chapter and meets the flight review requirements specified in 6156, a remote pilot certificate with a small UAS rating. So what do we mean in a manner acceptable to the administrator? So if you remember back to Subpart A, we talked about what is acceptable to the administrator or in a manner acceptable to the administrator. And this is going to be the IACRA system or on a Form 8710 or for future proofing, whatever the FAA may dig up to what they say, yes, you may apply to us in that manner, or this is a manner in which we find acceptable. Okay? So you want to be very wary of how you do this. In this particular case, you only got two options right now, and that's a FAA Form 8710 or the IACRA. Now, of course, if you do a UAS application, that is not a Form 8710. That's another application. So let's not get confused there, okay? So in essence, it's just through IACRA is what we want to verify now. And when you're doing that, you have to verify the identity of the applicant. And how would we verify the identity of the applicant? Well, we'd have to see a government-issued photo ID to verify and make sure it's a government issued by a federal or state agency and that it also has their birth date on there. That's very important as well. And lastly, after we verify the identity of the applicant, we also must be sure that we verify that an applicant for a student pilot certificate meets the eligibility requirements in 6183, or an applicant for a remote pilot certificate with a small UAS rating meets the eligibility requirements of 107.61 of this chapter. So if your intent is to give someone or sign someone off for a student pilot certificate, don't do it until they meet all the requirements of 61.83. It is your requirement as a flight instructor to make sure that they meet all those requirements before you click the submit button on that IACRA and sign it. And if you're going to be submitting a small UAS rating certification or an application, you need to make sure that you go to 107.61 and make sure that you comply with all that. If they don't meet all those requirements, don't sign that application. That would not be good for you. So let's go on to 6195 and talk about some flight instructor limitations and qualifications that you must hold. So a person who holds a flight instructor certificate is subject to the following limitations. And I'll just say these as A, B, C, D, E, or 1, 2, 3. It doesn't really matter. But the very first one is, in a 24-hour consecutive period, a flight instructor may not conduct more than 8 hours of flight training. Remember, that's a 24 consecutive hour period. That doesn't mean in a day, because if you start at 8 a.m. one morning and you instruct 8 hours, it's got to be 24 hours before you jump back in that airplane again, and that is very rare that happens. You want to make sure that if you come in prior to 8 o'clock the next day, you better not jump in that airplane if you did 8 hours previous, because that would be illegal. When is it going to be a problem? Well, when you have an incident or an accident and the FAA has to get involved and they start researching, that's when it's going to be a problem. Our next one here talks about aircraft ratings. And the reg states, except as provided in paragraph C, which we haven't got to, of this section, a flight instructor may not conduct flight training in an aircraft unless that flight instructor holds a flight instructor certificate with the applicable category and class, holds a pilot certificate with the applicable category and class, and meets the requirements of paragraph E of this section, of which we haven't got to yet. So let's go back and look at this. What does this mean here? Why is this 1 and 2 kind of close together? Well, let me explain what this means. You must hold a flight instructor certificate with the applicable category and class rating. So, if you were going to give multi-engine airplane, you've got to have multi-engine category and class, or airplane multi-engine category and class. If you're going to be doing the single engine, then you've got to have that class rating on your flight instructor certificate as well. But you couldn't hold those if you didn't have a pilot certificate with the same thing. And that is very important as well. And then it says meets the requirement of paragraph E. We will come back, but we will talk very briefly about an instrument rating. So a flight instructor may conduct instrument training for the issuance of an instrument rating, a type rating not limited to VFR, or the instrument training required for commercial pilot and airline transport pilot certificates if the following requirements are met. So when can you give instrument training? Well, it says here that except as provided in paragraph C2, which we have not got to, it's down here. The flight instructor must hold an instrument rating appropriate to the aircraft used for the instrument training on his or her flight instructor certificate. So you've got to have an instrument rating to give that training. You must also meet the requirements of paragraph B of this section. So if we go back to paragraph B, it states that a flight instructor may not conduct flight training in an aircraft unless that instructor holds a flight instructor certificate with the applicable category and class, or a pilot certificate with the applicable category and class. What does that mean? Well, that means that if I only hold like a double I, if I am just a double I and not a CFI for single or an MEI for multi, I could only give CFII training to what I had on my commercial pilot certificate. So if I wanted to give CFII instruction in a single engine airplane, I must hold a commercial single engine airplane rating on my pilot certificate, and that would also be the requirement for multi-engine training as well. So it says meet the requirements of paragraph B of this section, or hold a commercial pilot certificate or airline transport pilot certificate with the appropriate category and class ratings for the aircraft in which the instrument training is conducted, provided the pilot receiving the instrument training holds a pilot certificate with category and class appropriate to the aircraft in which the instrument training is being conducted, which, in essence, is exactly what I just said. Now, number 2 says, if the flight instructor is conducting the instrument training in a multi-engine airplane, the flight instructor must hold an instrument rating appropriate to the aircraft used for the instrument training on his or her flight instructor certificate and meet the requirements of paragraph B of this section, of which if we go back to B, you can see has to be appropriately rated. Okay, seems kind of redundant, but they put it in there for a reason to make sure they cover all their grounds, and they is the FAA. We go to paragraph D here, and it talks about limitations on endorsements. So endorsements that you may give a student or a pilot, what does it mean, limitations on these endorsements? Well, it's basically stating that if you want to give these endorsements, you must make sure you do a couple of things. So it says here, a flight instructor may not endorse a student pilot's logbook for solo flight privileges unless that flight instructor has given that student the flight training required for solo flight privileges required by this part, meaning you can't endorse them for solo flight if you've never flown with them. That's what that states. And determine that the student is prepared to conduct the flight safely under known circumstances, subject to any limitations listed in the student's logbook that the instructor considers necessary for the safety of the flight, which means that you can actually prepare any type of limitation on any type of endorsement that's basically necessary for the safety of flight. Number 2 says, a flight instructor may not endorse a student pilot's logbook for solo cross-country flight unless that flight instructor has determined that the student's flight preparation, planning, equipment, and proposed procedures are adequate for the proposed flight under the existing conditions and within any limitations listed in the logbook that the instructor considers necessary for the safety of flight. Meaning that if you go back to 6193 and you look at paragraph D, you do everything in D, you will have complied with this. So on this one here, if you'd like to put 6193D, that would be good reference point for that. And up here on this, solo flight privileges, this would be something like your 6187 November or 6187 Papa or 6187 Oscar. I guess I could have said those in order, NOP. So those are for that. Number 3, go back up to the top. A flight instructor may not endorse a student pilot's logbook for solo flight in a Class Bravo airspace or at an airport within Class Bravo airspace unless that flight instructor has given the student ground and flight training in that Class Bravo airspace or at that airport and determined that the student is proficient to operate the aircraft safely. And this is exactly what's mentioned in 6195 Alpha in Bravo, where Alpha is the airspace and Bravo is the airport. So next to 3, put 6195 Alpha in Bravo, and that would help with that. Let's go on to paragraph 4. A flight instructor may not endorse a logbook of a recreational pilot unless that flight instructor has given that pilot the ground and flight training required by this part and determined that the recreational pilot is proficient to operate the aircraft safely. And this goes back to our recreational subpart there, and as it starts to talk about in 6196 or 7 or whatever and above, and every time it says a recreational pilot must have an endorsement, well, this is what it's talking about here. So if you'd like to put some type of reference towards the regs for recreational pilot in this area, then that would be a good time to do that now. And of course, the CFI may not endorse a logbook of a pilot for a flight review unless you've actually done the flight review. Well, that's a big duh. And I don't even know why the FAA would put that in there unless some knuckle-headed, freaking stupid idiot CFI had done that. Just pencil whipping something. God, that's so stupid to do that. I don't know why anybody would pencil whip a logbook. Just do it. You got to have the experience and do it for the light. It's such a liability to not do your job correctly. And here's one of those things where some knucklehead did it, and now we have more regs to memorize. Also goes the thing for an instrument proficiency check too. Don't endorse someone's logbook unless you've actually done the IPC. Wow, why do we have to do this? E is pretty simple. It talks about training in an aircraft that requires a type rating It simply states here that if you do not have a type rating, you cannot give instruction in that aircraft. Pretty simple. Foxtrot, training received in a multi-engine airplane, a helicopter, or powered lift. If you want to give flight instruction in any of those three items there, multi-engine airplane, a helicopter, or powered lift, you must have had at least 5 flight hours of pilot and command time in the specific make and model of multi-engine airplane, helicopter, or power lift as appropriate that you want to give instruction in. Remember, that's only for multi-engine airplane, a helicopter, or a powered lift. It is not for single-engine airplane at all. So letter G, position in aircraft and required pilot stations for providing flight training. A flight instructor must perform all training from an aircraft that complies with the requirements of 91.109 of this chapter. So if we were to go to 91.109, it lists a couple of things that we should actually know about. So why don't we take just a second right now, let's flip over to 91.109, and let's take a look and see what that's all about. Okay, so here we are in 91.109. We're in a different regulation, and we're in 61 now. We're in part 91. And 91.109 says flight instruction, simulated instrument flight, and certain flight test. These are rules according to that. But we don't really care about the certain flight test, so we're not going to talk about that when we get to it. But we are going to talk about some of this other things, and let's just start from the top and go from there. No person may operate a civil aircraft that is being used for flight instruction unless that aircraft has fully functioning dual controls. However, instrument flight instruction may be given in an airplane that is equipped with a single functioning throwover control wheel that controls the elevator and ailerons in place of fixed dual controls when, and we have some things here. However, I think it's very important that we actually see this because I don't think a lot of you have actually seen this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually look over here and I'm going to put in here, let's see what it is, single throw over yoke. And we'll have some good images here that we can look at here for the airplane. So here's an airplane here. Here's one, bunch of pictures here. And we can look here and see this is a single functioning throw over yoke. There's another one here. I like this old one here. It looks very nice. You see that? You would literally pull this knob out and literally put that, throw it right over there. It's really cool design. You can just put it around. So literally when you say my controls, literally you could have the controls. That's amazing. If you are doing this, and you know we have the regulations that say you can't do it, it's no problem. They actually have this little conversion kit that you can to put on there, which actually makes this a double yoke. And here's a dual yoke here. You see it runs the same way. We'll look at a picture of that. You can see that goes right in the middle. But you can actually borrow a double yoke like that. That way you can just take the other one out. Your mechanic could, and you can mount this one on. And then you could give the proper flight instruction that you needed in it. But if you do have an airplane that does look like that with that single functioning throw over yoke there, that would be something that you would be very limited to if you were going to do that. So let's go back over here and let's look and see what it says again. You could give it for instrument flight instruction when the instructor has determined that the flight can be conducted safely and the person manipulating the controls has at least a private pilot certificate with appropriate category and class ratings. All right, so that's A. Let's look at B. B says an airplane equipped with a single functioning throwover control wheel, like we just looked at, that controls the elevator and ailerons in place of a fixed dual controls may be used for flight instruction to conduct a flight review required by 6156 or to obtain recent flight experience or an instrument proficiency check required by 6157 when the airplane is equipped with operable rudder pedals at both pilot stations and the pilot manipulating the controls is qualified to serve and serves as pilot in command during the entire flight, and the instructor is current and qualified to serve as pilot in command, meets requirements of 61.195, and has logged at least 25 hours of pilot in command time in the make and model of airplane, and the pilot in command and the instructor have determined that the flight can be conducted safely. If all of that is applicable, then you absolutely can use that according to paragraph B. Paragraph C says, no person may operate a civil aircraft in simulated instrument flight. Now, this one doesn't really necessarily mean you, but you have to know what it is because at some time you may serve as a safety pilot. And so if a person has if another person in the airplane has the foggles on, well, then this is what we have to talk about. Now, paragraph C doesn't necessarily revolve around flight instruction, but at some point you may give instruction in which you have the other person underneath the hood, and this is what this paragraph is talking about. Now, you couldn't do that unless the other control seat is occupied by a safety pilot, who technically would be you, who possesses at least a private pilot certificate with category and class ratings appropriate to the aircraft being flown, or for the purpose of providing training for a solo cross-country flight endorsed under 6193 of this chapter, a flight instructor certificate with an appropriate sport pilot rating and meets the requirements of 61.412 of this chapter if you're going to do sport pilot. Number 2, the safety pilot has adequate vision forward to and each side of the aircraft, or a competent observer in the aircraft adequately supplements the vision of the safety pilot. And lastly, except in the case of lighter than air aircraft, that aircraft is equipped with fully functioning dual controls. However, simulated instrument flight may be conducted in a single-engine airplane, equipped with a single functioning throw-over wheel in place of fixed dual controls of the elevator and ailerons when the safety pilot has determined that the flight can be conducted safely and the person manipulating the controls has at least a private pilot certificate with appropriate category and class rating. So please make sure that you meet these rules if any of this stuff is going to happen. We don't worry about D because that has to do with a flight test and we are not worried about that. So this is all of 61109 that we have. Not that much, but it does apply to you. And make sure that you do a little bit of research on this and create some scenarios to help you better understand it. And that's it. So with that being said, let's go back over to part 61. So we go back over here to part 61 and let's finish where we are here. So we left off right here at paragraph G. We went to part 91.109 and we talked about that. Golf 2 says, a flight instructor who provides flight training for a pilot certificate or rating issued under this part must provide that flight training in an aircraft that meets the following requirements. The aircraft must have at least 2 pilot stations, be of the same category, class, and type, if appropriate, that applies to the pilot certificate or rating sought, and for a single-place aircraft, the pre-solo flight training must have been provided in an aircraft that has 2 pilot stations and is of the same category, class, and type if appropriate. And that means that if you wanted to provide training for someone in a 2-seat airplane, but if you wanted to do that, you could provide them training in the 2-seater and then they could solo in the single-seater as long as it's very, very close to what you are flying. Paragraph H, qualifications of the flight instructor for training first-time flight instructor applicants. Although it talks about the flight instructor here, sometimes it's a little bit weird when you kind of read some of this stuff, but it says qualifications of the flight instructor for training first-time flight instructor applicants. But then it goes in and says the ground training provided to an initial applicant for a flight instructor certificate must be given by an authorized instructor who holds a ground or flight instructor certificate. Anyway, must hold a ground or flight instructor certificate with the appropriate rating and has held that rating for at least 24 calendar months and has given at least 40 hours of ground training. You know what the problem is here with this? Not a lot of instructors actually keep track of the ground training that they've actually done. And that's a problem because then when I go to certify someone to do this, my main thing is to ask them, show me how much ground training you've done, and a lot of them can't do it. Or holds a ground or flight instructor certificate with the appropriate rating and has given at least 100 hours of ground training and an FAA approved course. Now an FAA approved course, and it says holds a ground or flight instructor certificate with an appropriate rating and has given at least 100 hours of ground training in an FAA approved course. That means part 141. So that's what that means. If a ground or flight instructor has done that, then that will suffice. Now the next part talks about except for the instructor who meets the requirements of paragraph H3II, which is there. This section of flight instructor who provides, now we're talking about a flight instructor here. So a flight instructor who provides training to an initial applicant for a flight instructor certificate must meet the eligibility requirements of 61-183, hold the appropriate flight instructor certificate rating, have held that one for at least 24 months, and given 200 hours of flight training as a flight instructor. We don't really care about V because that's for a glider rating. And that's it of that. So what is this 2 saying? Basically saying you got to meet all the requirements of 183. You've got to hold the appropriate certificate and rating. You must have it for over 24 months, and you must have given 200 hours of flight instruction. I have known people who have interviewed for a position and as a flight instructor to give flight instruction for CFI initial applicants, and they had been a flight instructor for over 24 months, but they had not given over 200 hours of flight training. It's very important that you check for that if at one day you're required to check that for one of the companies that you may work for. Now, number 3 says a little bit different because this is not part 61 stuff. It gets into part 141, 142 stuff, and it says, a flight instructor who serves as a flight instructor in an FAA-approved course for the issuance of a flight instructor rating must hold a flight instructor certificate with the appropriate category appropriate rating and pass the required initial and recurrent flight instructor proficiency test. And those are usually done with the FAA, okay, in accordance with the requirements of the part under which the FAA-approved course is conducted. So if you're going to be on a 141, you've got to be able to do something with the FAA on that, and for 142, then you must be able to do something with the FAA on that. And must meet the requirements of paragraph H2 of this section, which if we go back up, there's H2, or have trained and endorsed at least 5 applicants for a practical test for a pilot certificate, flight instructor certificate, ground instructor certificate, or an additional rating, and at least 80% of those have passed on their first attempt, and given at least 400 hours of flight training as a flight instructor training an airplane, rotorcraft, or power lift, or given at least 100 hours of flight training as a flight instructor for training in a glider, which that doesn't apply to us. So if you look down and you actually look at each one of those, it's not very complicated because not all of that's going to apply to you. So when you get into 3 here and you look at all that stuff, you're like, that's pretty complicated. Well, no, not really, because the last one doesn't even apply to you, and so on and so on. So you can make this stuff where it actually makes sense. You just got to read it first. Let's move on. Paragraph I talks about prohibition against self-endorsements. So that's right, folks. Because you have a CFI rating, you just can't wake up one morning and you're like, yeah, I think I'll just give myself a 737 type rating. That's not the way that works. Or I'll just give myself a high performance endorsement. Does not work that way. You cannot do that. Paragraph J is only going to deal with training for Category 2 or Category 3 operations for ILS. We can completely bypass this for now unless that happens to you in the very near future. You can come back and read J, but that really doesn't apply to you. Paragraph K probably doesn't apply to us either because it's training for NVG stuff or night vision goggles, and that's not really something that we had to do with either. So that's J, K, and then if we go down here to L, this is, if you remember back in 61.109, and we looked in 61.109 Bravo 1, and 61.109 Bravo 1 talks about the 3 hours of instrument training that I must have. And it says 3 hours of instrument training on control and maneuver in an aircraft solely by reference to the instruments. And it says here that a flight instructor may conduct flight training on control and maneuver in an airplane solely by reference to flight instruments, provided that the instructor holds a flight instructor certificate with the applicable category and class, which that's you, or basically you have a CFII. So in this particular instance here, as long as you hold the flight instructor certificate with the applicable category and class, you're good to go to give training on control and maneuver in aircraft solely by reference to instruments, which is only required in 61.109 in regards to the private pilot training. Thank you very much for joining me again. I'm Todd Shelnut with CFI Pro Courses. Bye-bye.